There are watches you buy for their specifications. There are watches you buy for their name. And then there are those watches that stay with you for a much harder to explain reason, the feeling they give you when you look at them. And that's exactly what this video is about, because today I don't just want to talk to you about a watch. I want to talk to you about an idea, about an evolution, about a family of watches that, for years, has offered some of the most honest, most lovable, and most dangerously addictive pieces in all of affordable watchmaking. And at the center of all that is the Seiko 5S SNK621K1. But to understand why this watch is so special, it's not enough to look at it in isolation. You have to put it in context. You have to compare it with watches that represent different things. You have to go from the aspirational elegance of a Rolex Day-Date to the functional purity of a Rolex Explorer, and from the historical charm of a 1965 Seiko-matic weekdater to the brutal mechanical honesty of watches like the SNK621 and the SNK621. And you also have to look at what came after, with more modern models like the SRPD79K and the SRPE57. Because it's only when you see all these watches together that you truly understand where the SNK621K1 stands. And above all, you understand why it feels like a little hidden gem within the Seiko universe. Let's start at the top, way at the top, because when you talk about full-day indications and a classic, elegant, almost presidential presence, it's impossible not to think of the Rolex Day-Date. The Day-Date is one of those watches that needs no introduction. Its visual language already says a lot before anyone even tells you its name. The full-day window written in large letters, the date with a magnifier, the case in precious metal, the president bracelet, the fluted bezel. Everything about that watch speaks of power, status, and permanence. It's one of those designs that became a benchmark, not because they were the most aggressive, not because they were the most technical, but because they managed to build such a strong identity that, ever since, any watch with a similar presence inevitably makes you think of that kind of elegance. And this is where the conversation starts to get interesting, because when you look at the Seiko 5 SNK621K1 for the first time, you're obviously not looking at a Day-Date. They don't compete in price, they don't compete in materials, they don't compete in positioning, but they do share something very important, the ability to give personality to the day display. And that, in watchmaking, is rarer than it seems. Most watches handle the day display in a small, secondary, almost hidden way. It's there because it has to be, not because it's part of the soul of the design. On the other hand, there are watches that manage to turn that complication into character. And that's exactly where the SNK621K1 starts to stand out from the crowd, because this Seiko has something you wouldn't expect to find so easily in a watch of this segment: presence. Not an aggressive presence, not a presence of size, not a presence of ostentatious luxury, but a much more subtle and dangerous visual presence, the kind of watch that looks better than its price suggests. At first glance, the SNK621K1 might seem small, even modest. But when you take a closer look, the layers start to reveal themselves. The bluish-gray dial with a sunburst finish, the applied indices, the sleek hands, the compact proportions, and above all, that extremely rare full-day window at 6 o'clock, which instantly gives it character. That's the kind of detail that transforms a decent watch into a memorable one. And that's why this model can't be fully understood unless you connect it to a bigger story. Because if we take a small step to the side and look at the Rolex Explorer first, we find a completely different philosophy. Here, we're no longer talking about presidential elegance. Here, we're talking about purity, clarity, refined utility. A watch that built its identity not from classic luxury, but from functionality and legibility. The Explorer First is one of the most admired watches in the world precisely because of that. It doesn't try to impress with too many things. Its strength lies in the clean design, in the 3, 6, and 9 numerals, in its perfectly balanced black dial, in that feeling of a watch that could accompany you your whole life without ever tiring you. And although the SNK621K1 does not belong to the same aesthetic category, it does share something very important with the Explorer, the ability to do a lot with relatively little. Both watches show that you don't always need to complicate everything to create personality. Sometimes it's enough for the proportions to be right, for the dial to have intention, and for the watch to know exactly what it wants to be. And the SNK621K1 knows very well what it wants to be. It wants to be a special Seiko 5, one of those watches you discover without expecting much, and then it makes you stop, because in a universe full of accessible references, this watch manages to stand out with something that so many others lack, real visual identity. But to understand why that full-day window is so rare and so charming, we have to go back, much further back. And that's where a hugely important historical piece comes into this story, the Seiko-matic week data from 1965. For many enthusiasts, this watch represents a fascinating era in Japanese watchmaking, a period when Seiko was building its own language, with a great deal of aesthetic and technical ambition. And one of the most interesting things about the week data is precisely its way of displaying the calendar, with a tremendous amount of personality. When you see it, you realize that Seiko had already been exploring this kind of solution for decades. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a coincidence. There was a design sensibility behind it, and that gives even more value to the SNK621K1 because suddenly, it no longer seems like just a curious reference within the Seiko 5 line. Instead, it feels more like a modern echo of something much older. As if, among thousands of variants, a piece had appeared that captured a historic gesture and reinterpreted it in an accessible way. And that's where much of its magic lies. Because yes, this watch has a beautiful dial. Yes, it has a presence far beyond what its price suggests. Yes, it has a very complete and extremely rare day window. But beyond all that, it also has context, it has heritage, it holds a quiet little conversation with the brand's past. Now then, if we stop talking about pure design and move into the realm of real user experience, there are two watches that really help explain why so many people end up captivated by the Seiko 5, the SNX729 and the SNK879. The SNX79K is a great representation of one of the most classic, understated, and urban sides of the Seiko 5 universe. It's a discreet, versatile watch, easy to wear, and with that all-purpose vibe that Seiko does so well. It doesn't try to reinvent anything, it simply works. And sometimes that's enough to earn a permanent spot in a collection. The SNK809, on the other hand, goes in a different direction. It's more of a field watch, more of a tool, more straightforward, more military in its language, more utilitarian. It's the kind of watch that doesn't try to win you over with elegance, but with honesty. And although visually these two watches are very different from each other, both help to explain one of the great strengths of the Seiko 5, its mechanical and emotional consistency, because at the heart of many of these models lives the famous 726, a movement that, on paper, doesn't impress anyone with modernity. It doesn't have hacking, it doesn't have manual winding, it's not particularly refined, it doesn't try to compete with newer calibers in terms of sophistication, but it has something that many movements would need years to build: reputation. The 726 has earned an almost legendary reputation for being durable, tough, and absurdly reliable. It's one of those movements that doesn't win you over with glamour, but with longevity. It works, it keeps working, and often it keeps working when no one expected it to anymore. And that, when you look at watches like the SNX79K, the SNK809, and the SNK621K1, becomes an essential part of the conversation, because you're not just buying aesthetics, you're buying a philosophy. You're buying watches that, with all their limitations, convey honesty. Now then, if the SNX79K and the SNK809 help us understand the classic Seiko 5, then the SRPD79K and the SRPE57 help us understand where the brand moved afterwards. And this is where the contrast becomes very interesting. The SRPD79K represents a much more aggressive, more contemporary, even more tactical version of what a modern Seiko can be. Larger case, stronger presence, blackout aesthetic, more of an urban diver attitude, more visual impact, more of a tool watch feel, adapted to current tastes. It's a watch that appeals in a different way. Not for its delicacy, not for its historical rarity, not for its compact elegance. It stands out for its tactical personality, strong presence, and that stealth vibe that works so well today. The SRPE57, on the other hand, plays a different card. It's more versatile, cleaner, more balanced. It has something of a modern sports watch, but without losing that everyday, wearable quality that makes the current Seiko 5 Sports line so appealing. If the SRPD79K is tension, shadow, and attitude, the SRPE57 is balance. It's the watch that seems designed to appeal to a lot of people. Modern, comfortable, well-proportioned, and with an aesthetic that easily connects with today's tastes. And yet, when you put these two modern watches next to the SNK621K1, something curious happens. The new ones may win in features, may win in specifications, may win in presence for larger wrists, and may be easier to recommend on a comparison chart. But the SNK621K1 still has something that's incredibly hard to manufacture on purpose: charm. From the moment in our moment of Iain tamon dienone kastopai pokitaedin. Not charm as an excuse to cover up flaws, real charm, the kind that appears when a watch has restrained proportions, a dial full of life, a rare detail like the full-day display, and a personality that doesn't seem designed by committee. This particular timepiece does not shout for notice. It doesn't compete for attention. It never attempts to appear more rugged or more modern than it actually is. And I truly believe that is exactly why it is so remarkably unique and special. Because in the midst of a competitive market overflowing with watches trying to win you over with technical specifications, the SNK621K1 wins you over with deep emotional feelings. And that fundamentally and entirely transforms the way you perceive it. You no longer see it just as an old Seiko 5. You see it as a kind of meeting point between several very different ideas, the aspirational elegance that inevitably brings to mind the day-date. The clarity and purity of design that makes you think of the Explorer school. The historical depth that connects with the Seikomatic weekdater. The mechanical honesty of the SNX79K and the SNK809. And the contrast with the more direct modernity of the SRPD79K and the SRPE57. Suddenly, this little watch starts to feel much bigger than its size suggests. And that's the key, because if you analyze the SNK621K1 solely by a list of specifications, it probably won't win. It's not going to win for sapphire, it's not going to win for bracelet, it's not going to win for water resistance, it's not going to win for a modern movement, it's not going to win for massive wrist presence. But if you analyze it as a piece with identity, the story changes completely. It wins for its dial, it wins for its color, it wins for that blue-gray transition that never looks exactly the same, it wins for the balance of the design, it wins for the very unusual full-day display, it wins for how well it sits on the wrist, it wins for how hard it is to forget once you really take a good look at it. And that explains something very important: why so many enthusiasts get hooked on Seiko. Because Seiko didn't just make good watches, it made watches with character. Imperfect watches, yes. Watches with compromises, yes, but also watches that feel more personal, more human, and more memorable than their price would make you imagine. The SNX79K is one of those watches. The SNK809 is too. The SRPD79K and the SRPE57 show how the brand has evolved. The Seikomatic weekdater shows that all of this has deep roots. And the day-date and the original Explorer serve as a reminder that, in watchmaking, great designs always end up echoing in many other pieces. But the SNK621K1 somehow manages to bring together many of those ideas without losing its own identity. That's extremely difficult, because it's one thing to inspire associations and quite another to do so without feeling derivative, without seeming like a copy, without losing soul. And this watch achieves that. That's why, if I had to sum up this video in a single idea, it would be this. The SNK621K1 doesn't stand out for being the most modern watch. It stands out because it understands very well what kind of watch it wants to be, and around it, all these other models help to illuminate different aspects of its personality. The Rolex day date reminds us that a day indicator can be a central part of a watch's character. The original Rolex Explorer reminds us that clarity and purpose also build icons. The Seiko Week Dater 1965 shows us that Seiko has known how to play with these ideas for a very long time. The SNX79K and the SNK809 teach us about the strength of the classic Seiko 5 and the reputation of the 726. The SRPD79K and the SRPE57 show us how the concept changed when the brand moved toward a more modern sensibility. And among all of them, the SNK621K1 continues to shine with a very unique light. Small, yes. Modest, too. Perhaps even easy to underestimate. But precisely because of that, so satisfying to discover. It's not the most famous, it's not the most technical, it's not the most robust, it's not the newest, but it can certainly be one of the most charming of them all. And sometimes in this hobby, that is worth more than a perfect spec sheet. Because in the end, the watches we remember most aren't always the ones with the most features. Sometimes they're the ones that made us feel the best. And this one, without a doubt, is one of them. Now I want to ask you, if you had to choose just one watch from all the ones that appeared in this video, which one would it be? The strange charisma of the SNK621K1? The absolute authority of the day date? The purity of the Explorer? The history of the Seiko Matic? The honesty of the SNX79K or the SNK809? Or the modern energy of the SRPD79K and the SRPE57? Let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.